The jungle was alive in ways the invaders had never seen before. Towering trees with thick, gnarled roots clawed into the earth, their canopies forming an impenetrable fortress against the sky. A humid mist clung to the air, swirling with each movement, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying foliage. To the Galactic Empire, this was nothing more than a backward world, a planet of primitive terrain and unremarkable lifeforms. It was supposed to be an easy conquest. Commander Varen stood at the front of his scouting unit, his exosuit scanning for thermal signatures. The data streams running across his visor told him little. There was movement, heat fluctuations, but nothing concrete. His forces had conquered hundreds of planets, crushed rebellions in the deepest voids of space, and yet something about this world made his instincts itch. It was the wildness of it all, the way it defied order. Planets should be sleek, structured, cities built atop cities. This place had refused civilization, clung to its chaotic roots. Behind him, his soldiers moved with mechanical precision, their black armor shifting effortlessly through the undergrowth. They had been told there would be resistance, the last remnants of Earth's military, hiding in these jungles like frightened animals. It was almost amusing. The jungles were an obstacle, yes, but nothing that superior firepower couldn't reduce to ashes. A sharp, insect-like chirp cut through the air. One of his soldiers froze, hand raised in a fist. Silence fell over the unit. Varen's eyes flickered across his display. Something was wrong. The forest had been alive with noise only seconds ago, birds, rustling leaves, the ambient hum of creatures unseen. Now it was dead quiet. A flash of movement. The first shot was nearly imperceptible, a whisper of sound. One of the soldiers jerked backward, falling without so much as a cry. The momentary delay in reaction, less than a second, cost them another. A third. The shadows themselves had turned against them, picking them off one by one. Return fire. Varen barked, his rifle snapping into position. Beams of plasma tore through the vegetation, carving smoking holes in ancient trunks. The jungle answered with silence. Then came the whispers. Not voices, not words, but the sound of movement just beyond reach, branches shifting, leaves brushing together, the suggestion of presence. His men were turning in circles now, firing wildly at ghosts. Tactical displays were useless. The jungle distorted sensors. Heat signatures were everywhere and nowhere at once. Varen gritted his teeth. The humans had technology far beneath their own, yet they had turned their home into a weapon. He had studied their kind, read the reports of their past wars. Primitive, unstructured. But now, standing in the darkness of this jungle, he understood something the reports had failed to capture. These weren't soldiers defending a battlefield. These were hunters guarding their hunting ground. A scream broke through the comms, then static. Another soldier down. He turned sharply, catching only the briefest glimpse of a figure melting back into the shadows. Human, clad in some sort of ragged, shifting camouflage. The air pulsed with the tension of unseen predators. Varen switched to infrared. Still nothing but shifting heat. The jungle was too alive, its temperature too unpredictable, masking the bodies of his enemy as though the planet itself fought alongside them. His hands clenched around his weapon. He would not be undone by this place, by these savages. Regroup, he ordered, voice like steel. We move out. The survivors pulled in closer, forming a defensive ring. They trudged forward, discipline faltering, each one hyper-aware that their number was dwindling. Then the ground erupted beneath them. Explosions rocked the jungle, not large enough to kill outright, but enough to sow panic. Smoke mingled with the mist, creating a wall of confusion. Somewhere in the chaos, a guttural voice rang out in Galactic Standard. Welcome to the jungle. It was followed by a sharp whistle, a signal of some kind. The enemy fell upon them. Varen barely registered the blur of motion before a blade slashed through the air, narrowly missing his throat. He fired instinctively, But the attacker had already vanished. Another of his soldiers was yanked backward into the brush, disappearing with a strangled gurgle. These humans, they weren't running. They weren't hiding. They were hunting. A cold realization settled over him as he fought to regain control. His forces were superior in every way. On any other world, they would have crushed this resistance in hours. But here in the depths of this untamed wilderness, technology meant nothing. His armor was a hindrance, his sensors were blind, his training was useless. And his enemy knew it. Varen's breathing was steady, but his mind was racing. This was no ragtag group of survivors. These were specialists, soldiers trained for terrain like this, for war in the shadows. And they had let him walk right into their trap. They had never been prey. They had been waiting. Varen crouched low, his back pressed against the gnarled trunk of an ancient tree, his pulse hammering in his ears. The jungle pressed in around him, thick and suffocating, alive with sounds that his mind struggled to separate. Was that just the rustling of leaves in the wind, or the whisper of a predator moving in the dark? His remaining soldiers formed a tight perimeter, their weapons tracking every shift in the undergrowth. They were fewer now, far fewer, and the jungle had swallowed the dead without a trace. The enemy was relentless. No direct assaults, no wasteful displays of force, only death in the unseen spaces between moments. The bodies of his soldiers had disappeared almost as soon as they had fallen, dragged into the underbrush before anyone could react. The silence was worse than the fighting. There were no cries of pain, no desperate last words. Just an absence, a sudden and irrevocable erasure of his forces one by one. He had underestimated them. The thought sent a bitter taste to his mouth. Humans were supposed to be primitive, undisciplined, fragile. But they had turned this land into a weapon, and now his elite unit, soldiers trained to break planetary resistance in hours, was being torn apart by an enemy that never showed its face. This was not war as the Galactic Empire knew it. This was something older, something far more terrifying. A branch snapped in the distance, and one of his soldiers fired instinctively. The plasma round streaked through the mist, illuminating the jungle for the briefest of seconds before vanishing into the dense foliage. Nothing. No movement. No scream of a dying enemy. Just more silence. Then the laughter began, soft at first, drifting through the trees like a ghostly echo. It wasn't mocking, nor was it cruel. It was something worse. It was amused. Varen gritted his teeth and signaled for his squad to move. Staying in one place was a death sentence. They had to reach the clearing, where their gunship could extract them. Every step forward felt like wading into quicksand. Slow, uncertain, suffocating. His visor struggled to keep up, feeding him false readings as the jungle distorted every scan. Shadows moved where there were none. Heat signatures flared and disappeared, rendering their technology useless. A shrill whistle cut through the air. The sound was unnatural, deliberate. A signal. The jungle exploded with movement. Figures burst from the undergrowth, their ghillie suits rendering them as much a part of the terrain as the trees themselves. Blades flashed, silent and deadly, striking before Varen's soldiers could react. He swung his rifle up, firing wildly as the enemy weaved through the chaos. A soldier beside him screamed as a knife plunged into his side. Another was yanked backward into the shadows, his outstretched hand the last thing Varen saw before he disappeared completely. This wasn't battle. This was slaughter. Varen adjusted his grip, switching to thermal optics in a desperate bid for visibility. The screen was a mess of overlapping signatures, the jungle's heat masking human and plant alike. But something stood out, faint impressions, barely distinguishable from the background radiation, moving in erratic, calculated patterns. He had them. He fired. And for the first time, one of the ghosts fell. A soldier in jungle fatigues crumpled to the ground, blood misting the air around him. For a brief moment, Varen thought it would shift the tide of battle. It didn't. The others barely reacted. No hesitation, no faltering in their attacks. No fear. They fought like animals that knew the kill was inevitable. Another plasma bolt seared through the trees, and one of the human soldiers staggered back, a burn mark across his shoulder. He didn't retreat. Instead, he lunged forward, bringing a combat knife down into the visor of the nearest Imperial trooper, twisting until the light in the soldier's helmet flickered out. Varen had seen bravery before. He had seen desperation, madness, defiance. But this was different. This was patience. His people fought for conquest, for the expansion of the Empire. These humans fought for something else entirely. Not just survival. Ownership. This jungle belonged to them. This war belonged to them. And they knew it. Another sharp whistle rang out, and as suddenly as they had appeared, the humans melted back into the trees. The silence returned, thick and oppressive, punctuated only by the ragged breathing of the few surviving troopers. Varen took stock. Less than a dozen of his soldiers remained, their armor scratched, some of them bleeding, all of them shaken. He clenched his fists, rage warring with something colder, something unfamiliar. Fear. He had thought them weak. He had thought them beneath him. And yet, the jungle had become a graveyard, and his men were the ones buried beneath its roots. A soft, deliberate sound drew his attention. Not an attack. Not an accident. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into a shaft of moonlight filtering through the canopy. Unlike the others, this one did not wear a ghillie suit. His gear was tactical, efficient, but not designed for concealment. He wanted to be seen. The human tilted his head slightly, assessing Varen with eyes that held no fear, no anger. Only certainty. He held a single combat knife, its blade still wet with blood. Varen raised his weapon, but the human didn't move, didn't even blink. Instead, he spoke, his voice calm, almost conversational. "You don't belong here." A statement, not a threat. The words sent a ripple through Varen's thoughts, an understanding settling in his chest like a weight. This wasn't a war they could win. Not here. Varen's breathing was controlled, but his mind was unraveling. His forces, his elite soldiers, trained to crush planetary resistance in hours, were gone. The jungle had consumed them. The enemy had dismantled them. And now, as the last remnants of his unit huddled together, their weapons raised, their movements sharp with panic, he understood what true defeat felt like. The human still stood in the moonlight, his expression unreadable. He did not posture, did not gloat. He only watched. A trick. A feint. Varen forced his focus to steady, recalibrating his thoughts into something useful. His forces may have been whittled down to almost nothing, but the mission had not changed. They needed to break through, reach the clearing, and signal the extraction team. His fingers twitched over the controls on his wrist, sending a silent command to his remaining troops. The few that were left formed up without hesitation, creating a loose circle, rifles sweeping the darkness for signs of another ambush. They would not die in this place. They would not be hunted like animals. The human tilted his head, then raised a hand and gestured. 2 fingers flicked downward. A simple motion. A signal. The jungle erupted. Explosions rocked the ground. Not the brilliant plasma detonations of orbital bombardments, but something more primal. Fire and shrapnel. Sharpened wooden stakes laced with toxins. Hidden pits that collapsed beneath unwary steps. The Empire's technology, built for overwhelming force, was useless against an enemy that had no need for conventional battle. Varen dodged a collapsing tree, its massive trunk splintering under the force of a triggered charge. The jungle was shifting around them, reshaping itself into a trap that funneled them exactly where the enemy wanted. A clearing. For a moment, hope sparked. The sky was open above, and the extraction beacon was already active, pulsing a faint blue light into the darkness. If they could hold this position, they could escape. Then he saw them. Figures lined the treetops, perched on thick branches, their rifles trained downward. Others moved through the underbrush, closing in without a sound. They had never been running. They had been herding. The realization struck like a physical blow. This was the final act. One of his soldiers panicked, spinning toward the trees and firing wildly. The plasma rounds burned through leaves and shattered bark, but none of them hit their mark. The return shot was clean, precise. The trooper fell, a neat hole punched through his visor. Silence settled again. Varen clenched his jaw, stepping forward. His weapon was still raised, but he did not fire. He already knew it would change nothing. The human, the one who had revealed himself earlier, stood at the edge of the clearing, watching. Varen met his gaze. "If you mean to kill us, do it." The human was quiet for a moment. Then, with deliberate slowness, he sheathed his knife. "You were given a chance to leave," he said. "You didn't take it." Varen's grip tightened on his rifle. "The Empire does not retreat." A faint smirk. "The jungle doesn't care." A low rumble echoed in the distance. Engines. The extraction craft was approaching, cutting through the thick cloud cover, its floodlights piercing the darkness. Varen could see the outline of the dropship now, sleek and angular, salvation descending from above. The human made no move to stop it. None of them did. They only watched. The realization was slow, crawling through Varen's mind like ice spreading through his veins. They weren't stopping the retreat, because they had already won. Varen turned, scanning the treetops, the underbrush, the flickering movement of camouflaged figures just beyond reach. These weren't just survivors. They weren't rebels, clinging to a doomed world. They were something else entirely. The Empire had believed Earth was weak, its people fractured, its wildlands untamed. But the truth was far worse. This planet was a hunting ground, and humanity was the apex predator. The dropship landed, its ramp lowering in a hiss of hydraulics. Varen stepped back, keeping his eyes locked on the human commander. "This isn't over." The human didn't smile. "It was over the moment you set foot here." Varen turned sharply, boarding the ship without another word. His remaining soldiers followed, battered and broken. The moment the hatch sealed behind them, he let out a slow breath. The Empire would return. It always did. But next time, they would not underestimate this world. Next time, they would not hunt. They would survive,